Before we get into the real nitty gritty here for chapter 13, it is worth a look back to structures just so that we can compare what is happening here with classes to what has happened in the past with structures. Overall, a structure and a class are very, very similar. Both of them are developer defined needs that you identify are going to be reoccurring within your development. So in the past, we have used examples about students. We have used examples about things like, shapes, rectangles, etc. And all of that can be done within a structure. We wouldn't technically need classes to be able to do that. The very, very biggest difference between a structure and a class, as we are going to be implementing them, is the idea of public versus private. And it's one of the things that we cannot really give you a fair shake at here with the developments that we can do in class, because they are, and I'm looking at some of these, like 130 lines, and that includes comments and the fielding, so the forward slashes, the boxes that make it look like a comment box. That's 27 lines of code. So it's better to think of the idea of public versus private if we take a step back, and instead of look at a single development, let's just look at what's happening for a student structure or a student class, as we'll get to know to call them here in chapter 13. So the thing to think about here is a student structure. So let's say you as a student structure, and we have the idea of public versus private data. Now, a question to ask yourself would be, who should be able to change the elements in your student structure? So like we talked about in chapter 12, we were looking at things like student first name, student last name, student ID number, things of that nature. Now, all of those technically belong to you as a student, right? I think clearly your name is your name. But what about your ID number? Is your student ID number something that you should be able to change? No, right? So a structure isn't a perfect implementation of that, because anything that has access to the structure has access to changing your student ID number. Now, if we kind of walk that back and look at all the different entities within the Rock Valley College organization, how about a faculty? Is there anything about your student structure that I should be able to change? If you think about the hierarchy of a school, right? I will not say that in any way, shape, or form a faculty is a highly regarded member of a school. We are the second to the bottom rung. We ain't that much. But you know what we're over? Students. So as a faculty, even though I would have an elevated permission, arguably, I would have an elevated permission set, I shouldn't be able to change your student ID number. And more than that, I shouldn't be able to change your name, your address, your GPA, or anything. But what about a dean? So let's go 2 levels up from where a faculty is. Should a dean be able to change your student ID number? No. What the heck would be the point of that, right? How about your last name? Potentially, I would argue that maybe, because last names do change. Maybe, but probably not, right? How about the president? The president of the college. Should they be able to change your student ID number, or your last name, or your first name, or your GPA, or any of those things? No. Absolutely not, right? And the problem with the structure, again, is all members of the structure, whether or not they are variables or functions, all members of the structure are public, which means that anything can change them. So looking ahead here to the idea of a class, it's going to look very, very similar to a structure. As a matter of fact, that's why we do structure first. It allows us to do the heavy lifting there. You know, the idea of a developer creating a nomenclature for an entity that we need within our development that has a purpose within our organization. That's brand new stuff, right? But now it's not so much of a heavy lift to get used to the rules that are going to apply to you here within classes, because we've already done a lot of this with the structure. The big difference here is going to be, as a developer, you have to start thinking about who, so not necessarily individuals, but what functions should have access to what pieces of data. And that's going to be important, because the breakdowns that happen in a program are usually because you gave access to something that wasn't supposed to be changed. So again, I'm not trying to use the word structure here. The overall capacity and ability of a class very, very closely does resemble a structure. It's just that now we get to be much more granular with how the data members and how the functions of those structures, or in that really now it's those classes, are going to be accessed.